Each year, you see thousands of people line the streets of Vancouver ready to run, jog, even walk in the Vancouver Sun Run. That run and the living of healthy lifestyles are just two of the legacies Doug and Diane Clement inspired in BC, and it has enriched all of our lives. All kids love to run, but at some point you must have become aware, both of you, that you had a special talent for running. Do you remember how old you were when?
Yeah, I guess the thing I remember most vividly about that period of time is that running outdoors on the streets, people would look at you and say, what's going on? I mean, you're a crazy person. I mean, it was the idea of exercise for health or for enjoyment by the general public was not even known. Diane, you started off in basketball, and I started off in football and rugby as our first choices. And so running came in sort of behind the scenes, if you will.
Well, running, my dad, he was a runner, a sprinter. He started at the Moncton Olympic Club, and we used to train down along the sort of the dikes and the river. And mosquitoes. I think I learned to run so fast because I was like, oh my God, these mosquitoes. And so I started in Moncton. And then my dad was offered a position in Montreal, and I moved to Montreal, joined the track club there, and then went from there, and then sort of tried out for the Olympic Games. And at that time, women had a choice of two running events, 100 or 200. Because the IOC said if they trained for more than that, it would be too strenuous, they would not bear children. And look what we're doing. Look what women in sport are doing today.
And I can remember very clearly being taught in what was then physical education, now kinesiology, and it was quite clear that women could not possibly do anything that had created sweat even. I mean, it was going to be detrimental, and that this would ruin them.
Yeah.
And as such, the limitations on women and sport were unbelievable. I mean, they didn't even have, in 1951 to 1955, when I was it wasn't allowed, no women in sport at all. I can remember very clearly in Los Angeles in 1984 was the first women's marathon.
With Joni
Benoit.
Benoit.
Won it from the U.S., and Diane actually had run into her in the lobby of the building.
Well, yeah, we were at a conference in Edmonton, and so over a glass of champagne, Charmaine and I and Joni were chatting and just saying, look what women are doing now, and to think that, we could never bear children. She said, how many did you have? I said, I have 2. She said, I have 3. She said, we goddamn proved them wrong.
I think the idea that running and health and exercise sort of came out of the interest that evolved, myself being an athlete and an Olympian, and then going into medicine, and then going into Richmond back in 1959, 60. It was the idea of starting a track club. And so the municipality had come to Diane and I and said, would you start a track club? If you do, we'll build a stadium and a track. And of course, this was quite an incentive. We had not thought about ever coaching, but then all of a sudden, I limited my practice at that stage to only 2 athletes. Because some of the things we were running into, there was no sports medicine at that point. There was no journals, there was no books, there was no nothing. So I kept keeping notes and trying to sort out some of these things. And then, of course, that evolved into the idea, I can remember a study done in 1948 on the London bus drivers and the conductors. And they looked at heart disease attack rates in both those positions, one moving around the bus all the time, the other one sitting. Mm-hmm. And it was dramatic, that if you were the conductor, you were going to be healthy. But if you were a driver, you were going to get a heart attack. And that was the first episode where the idea that physical activity and your health were in any way connected. I can remember speaking at the BC Medical Association out at Harrison Hot Springs. And I made a presentation based on this information and research done in London. And the cardiologist got up and walked out of the room, said this was total baloney. Because if you had a heart attack, in the 40s and 50s or earlier, you were put to bed, you had to use a bedpan, you couldn't get out of the bed for 30 days straight. And if you got up and moved around, you were going to drop dead. That was the fear. And so the idea of exercise being utilized to rehabilitate people with heart disease just wasn't known. And of course, that led ultimately to me leaving and joining one of the athletes that I used to coach, Dr. Jack Taunton. And so that very shortly afterwards led to UBC inviting us to start a division of sports medicine, and that led, of course, to the whole concept about the research that has been done at UBC surrounding exercise and health.
Doug, everyone talks about you as being one of the creators, really, of this new specialty within medicine, sports medicine. And from your clinic out at UBC, what interested me was the philosophy was quite different from if you had a sports injury somewhere else, they'd often give you some medication and off you go, right? And your clinic, the philosophy seemed to be, how can I get you back to whatever sport it is?
Exactly. Yeah, we weren't interested in them just walking out of the door. Being healthy. We wanted the idea of rehabilitation and the dealing with the issues that were interrupting their ability to exercise. And that, of course, then ultimately led to the creation of the Vancouver Sun Run, which started off with about less than 2,300 down the main street.
2,300.
Down Georgia. And it's grown to, in its peak years, to being over 50, close to 60,000 people.
Was it hard going in those early days, Diane?
Well, it was, I think, for Doug and I as Olympians, as athletes that received so much, to be able to give back and to see not all of them are going to make a team, not all of them are going to make, sort of go on to get medals, but it changed their lives emotionally to give them confidence. And one of my philosophies was, in a race, they'd, particularly the longer distances, they'd quit, step off the track. And I'd see Doug walking and then the athletes, and I remember in Gillespie sitting up with me and saying, uh-oh, here it comes. The hand goes on the athlete, and he's going, I don't care where you finish the race. And that's life.
When you started coaching, that transition must have been quite interesting, because when you're an Olympic athlete, you're focused on yourself. This is my training schedule. This is me. This is my head. This is where I'm going. All of a sudden, as a coach, you haven't got the control that you had over yourself.
Actually, it's more stressful being a coach than an athlete. Yeah. But there's nothing to match the excitement of sport. And there's nothing to match the excitement of being a coach in the good days and bad days, because you're suffering along with everybody at the same time.
And the other interesting thing is that there weren't that many women coaching at that level. And also at that time, eventually for the Olympic Games in Montreal, I was president of Athletics Canada, one of the first women presidents in the world to represent the country. And so for a woman president at that time, like in business, it was, very challenging.
A pioneer.
Well, you were shattering so many glass ceilings, because you also were the first woman at UBC to coach the women's track and field as well.
Oh, you remember that? Yeah.
And so my question to you is, were you aware at the time that you were breaking all these barriers, or were you just carrying on?
Yeah, I think about that a lot, and I don't think it was anything other than just getting the job. It didn't seem unnatural. At the time, it just seemed. But at the same time, now looking at it in retrospect, you can see that, how unfair things have been, not just to women, but to many, many other parts of our lives, where racism and prejudice and all sorts of things have been barriers. And I think that without knowing it, Diane, I think, was not going to be stopped.
No.
When you decided that Vancouver should actually have an international track meet, and let's do it with Harry Jerome, that couldn't have been easy.
Well, it was a challenge. It all started, this whole concept of having an international competition here started with the fact that in 1956, when we both went to Melbourne, Australia for the 56 Olympic Games, the trials, I think, were in July, and the games themselves were in October, November actually. And so between the trials and November, there wasn't one competition open to the Canadians.
Oh, a challenge. That's like bait for Doug and Diane. However, international track meets, they cost money and lots of it. And seeing as the event was taking place at Exhibition Stadium in September, they needed rain insurance, of course. A wise choice, because as you can imagine, it did rain. It really rained. They collected the insurance money and also ran the race.
That, and of course, Harry Jerome won the bronze medal in the 100 meters, and Bill Carruthers from Toronto won the silver medal in the 800. And so that may have been a little bit of help in moving them towards those goals. But of course, later we chose Harry Jerome to honor with the current, I guess we're now in our 38th year, something like that, that the Jerome has been held. And so it's been a wonderful experience, and our passion and love for sport and for life has just been great.
So how do you prepare and train? Like how many years, how many hours, like what's involved?
It was intense, and I was going to university at the same time, and but it was your dedication, and I played on the basketball team as well. So it was that dedication, like anything else, you know?
I think compared to today, though, to be very clear, the 40s, 50s, and part of the 60s were truly amateur. There was no professionalism,
right.
no money was exchanged, and so it was very strict that people in sport could not take money. And
that's
and
right.
That led to a different philosophy in regards to training, all sorts of things. It was never thought of to be a career. But that, of course, has changed as the amateur rules have long passed, and so we see people devoting much more time, and of course, sports medicine, all sorts of things have evolved into the current state where it is really high performance.
So remember the moment that you first walked into the Olympic Stadium?
Oh, yeah.
What were the emotions that you felt?
Well, there was, how many people were in the stands in Melbourne? It was like
about 100,000.
But yeah, I was going to say 75 to 100. And you walk in and you're so proud. You're wearing your Canadian uniform and you look at all the crowd. Then you somehow, as you're walking around, you spot the Canadian section with all the. Literally, it is tears. I mean, it's a moment that is a highlight of your life. Really, it is. And just, am I really here? And then to live in the village and to experience all the international athletes from all over the world, eating in the same dining room and wishing them luck. And it's a moment in life that you can't relive in any other fashion except to embrace it and enjoy it.
It actually is sort of where we're at. I think Vancouver in particular is sort of I like to think of it as a model of globalism, that we have people from all parts of the world here, particularly the Asia-Pacific region. And we suddenly see a harmony that doesn't exist exactly this way in older countries, where the way of doing things in France or the way of doing things in Sweden or wherever,
England,
they're dominantly, historically longer. Whereas North America, with due respect to our indigenous past, is often seen as an influx of people from all parts of the world. And it gives me hope, I think, that Vancouver at this point is doing so well in regards to integration and looking at this at a more global concept. I see a place like Singapore and Vancouver being sort of similar, where there isn't a dominant culture. It's a mixture of cultures.
So we've talked about the highlights of the Olympics, but sometimes there are lowlights. And I wonder if you could talk to me a little bit about the '88 Seoul Olympics and Ben Johnson.
Yes. Well, somebody came over to me, part of our team, said, Diane, you have to go to the village right now. And I went there, and they took me up in the hotel room. And there was Richard Pound. He said, Diane, we have a problem. And I went, oh, my God. And so they said that he was tested positive, and that had gone all over the world already. The story had gone, and we had to deal with this problem. And it was our day off. Then the competition started the next day. I said, look, I am at the finish line of the 100. He finishes. I grab him. We get up to CBC, get the interview, and then we go from there to doping room. I leave him at doping room, and I said, I'll be back to pick you up. And then we went from there. And then the whole thing blew up. So, he was like part of my team family. And so for me, it was such a stress that I had to announce to the team to let them know, and a stress to our whole team. And knowing...
Were you surprised?
There were rumors.
Of course, there were very clear concepts and rumors about East Germany, about the Soviet situation in USSR at that point. And of course, we knew their drug use was there. And it was one of, as you say, the underbelly of sport, not just Olympic sport and not just track and field, but all sport. And so there was this suspicion. On the other hand, he never failed to get a test that ever indicated that he had been taking anything illegally. But I actually, in my resignation, if you will, from that medical role, was based on the fact that they were just testing at competition. And I said, there's no point of testing people at competition.
No.
You must do it out of competition. You've got to do it during the training period.
To surprise them.
And honestly, there were many members of the Canadian administration of sport who weren't really interested in doing that. And I kept insisting that you're not going to find any positive tests at a competition. You've got to do it when they're preparing.
Yeah.
And we'll never forget, because in the fall, after this happened, the government announced they were going to do out-of-season testing.
Even legends are human. What makes them legendary is how they face and overcome really significant challenges. The kind of challenges that immobilize mere mortals. Now, no one has a path to success that's just a perfect straight line.
Yes.
There are always bumps along the way. And Doug, you certainly had a challenge at 65 when you had a stroke.
Yeah.
Can you describe that experience?
Yeah, that was humbling in many ways. I, as a physician and a proponent of healthy living, it came as a surprise. I just collapsed and vomiting, and I couldn't get up. It was an experience you just can't imagine. It was. I think it took me about an hour to crawl across the floor, because Diane was still sleeping upstairs.
Up the stairs and across the living room, dining room, and then he fell at the bed and he goes, I can't move.
The one element that was positive about it, having a cerebellar stroke, which it ended up being secondary to atrial fibrillation, which is a common component of lifelong endurance activity. That's the downside of what physical activity can do. It exposes you to conductive issues within your heart that cause an irregular heartbeat and leads to, shall we say, barnacles forming on the valves and walls of the heart that can break off and then produce a flying bomb, if you will. And for whatever reason, I don't know, I just believed that I was going to get better, and I worked hard. And so I followed this idea that the more you retrain your brain to work, because if you tried to do something automatically, you'd fall. But if you thought every moment of what you were going to do, you could get it away as long as no one talked to you or interrupted you. So it was like forming new pathways for balance and for movement, which I didn't have at the beginning. And so it was, what it proved to me is that the brain is a very plastic organ. In my days in medical school, the thought that any form of central nervous system damage was permanent is so wrong. I really think that we're in the dark ages in regards to the central nervous system and consciousness and the brain and dementia. All these things are, we're looking at a complex system that we do not yet understand fully and don't. We've had assumptions that if you accept them, you would blockade yourself from improvement. And that was, if you damage central nervous system tissue, it won't get better. That is wrong, totally wrong. And we've had generations and generations of doctors trained that way. And, it takes time to change people's perspectives. But that's the way everything has evolved historically in medicine as well. So it's not unusual if we look back over centuries, but we've been in the dark ages about that, and we're still in the dark ages about many things in terms of mental health.
Can I ask you just to look back on your enormously successful and diverse careers and ask you, do you have any regrets? Anything you would have done differently?
I think out of every challenge or bump or fall, that you learn something. And having a stroke was not a negative thing for me. It was extremely positive. There's no end point. There is no finish line. There's only gaining knowledge and viewpoints that are useful as you move forward.
Doug and Diane Clement, two of BC's legends who are always looking over the horizon, wondering what new wonders will come their way.